3 days before General George Patton was supposed to board a plane home to America, he was dead. No battle. No enemy fire. Just a car accident on a quiet road. And the man who survived 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history couldn't survive a low-speed collision in peacetime Germany. That alone should make you suspicious. But here's what nobody tells you. In the weeks before he died, Patton had been making enemies. Powerful ones. He had been saying things out loud that men in his position were never supposed to say. And he had delivered a warning, a direct, personal warning, aimed at the most dangerous man alive. Joseph Stalin. What was in that warning? Who else heard it? And why did Patton's death come at exactly the moment it would be most convenient? By the end of this video, you're going to see one of history's most decorated generals in a completely different light. And you may never look at the official story the same way again. Let's go back to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe is over. Hitler is dead. Germany has surrendered. The world is exhaling for the first time in 6 years. But George Patton isn't celebrating. While his fellow generals are shaking hands and posing for photographs, Patton is pacing. He's restless. Angry. Because he sees something that almost no one else in the Allied High Command is willing to see. The Soviet Union has just devoured half of Europe. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Country after country, swallowed whole by Stalin's forces under the cover of liberation. And the Western Allies are letting it happen. Roosevelt's deal at Yalta had essentially handed Stalin everything east of Berlin on a silver platter. Patton thought it was a catastrophe. But what most people don't know is that Patton didn't just think it privately. He said it loudly. To anyone who would listen. To journalists. To politicians. To other generals. He called the Soviets what he believed they were, not allies but the next enemy. And he said the United States Army should turn around right now while it still had the strength, and push the Soviets back to Russia's own borders. In 1945, that kind of talk could end a career. For Patton it would do much worse. To understand why Patton's warning mattered so much, you have to understand who George Patton actually was by the end of World War II. This wasn't some fringe general with a grudge. This was the man Eisenhower called his best field commander. The man Hitler feared more than any other Allied officer. The man whose Third Army had moved so fast across France that supply lines literally couldn't keep up with him. Patton was a legend. A warrior who seemed to belong to another age entirely. He carried ivory-handled revolvers. He believed in reincarnation, that he had fought in ancient battles across centuries. He quoted Napoleon from memory. He wept at the sight of fallen soldiers and then gave orders that sent thousands more to die. He was, in every sense, larger than life. And that's exactly what made him dangerous. Because a man like Patton, with his reputation, his credibility, his popularity with the American public, if he stood up and said, Stalin is the real enemy and we need to fight him now, people would listen. Congress would listen. The American people would listen. And Stalin knew it. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe because the ending reveals something most history books barely mention. Now here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. In August 1945, Patton was removed from command of the Third Army. The official reason? He made a remark at a press conference comparing Nazi Party members to American Democrats and Republicans, suggesting that former Nazis should be allowed to help run post-war Germany because someone needed to keep the infrastructure running. The press went wild. Eisenhower was furious. Patton was stripped of his command and given a paper job, overseeing the writing of military histories. It was a humiliation designed to silence him. But it didn't work. What most people don't realize is that Patton used his sudden free time to become even more outspoken. With no army to command, no battles to plan, he focused all of his considerable intensity on the political situation unfolding around him. He was watching American and British forces withdraw from territories they had fought and bled to capture. He was watching the Soviets flood in behind them. And he was writing it all down. His diary from this period is extraordinary. Blunt, raw, and genuinely alarming. He wrote that the Allies had destroyed the only decent people in Europe, meaning Germany, and handed the continent to Mongolian savages. His language was brutal, often ugly. But beneath the coarseness was a strategic argument that would eventually be proven correct. That the Soviet Union was an expansionist power that needed to be confronted, not accommodated. He wasn't the only one who believed this. But he was the loudest. And the most famous. And that's where things took an unexpected turn. Patton began talking about running for office. Think about that for a moment. The most famous general in America, a man with a public profile rivaling Eisenhower himself, was considering entering politics specifically to warn the American people about the Soviet threat. He had a platform. He had credibility. He had an argument that millions of Americans, veterans, parents of veterans, ordinary citizens exhausted by war but not blind to what was happening in Europe, might actually believe. He also had specific information. During his time commanding occupied Germany, Patton had access to intelligence briefings that most politicians in Washington never saw. He knew the scale of Soviet military buildup in Eastern Europe. He understood the logistics of what Stalin had positioned on the border. He knew that the window to push back, if it was ever going to happen, was closing fast. And he was preparing to go public with all of it. In late November 1945, Patton told friends he was going home to America in December. He was done with the military. He was going to resign his commission, write a book, go on a speaking tour, and tell the American people exactly what their government wasn't telling them about Stalin and the Soviets. He gave himself a deadline, December 10, 1945. He never made it. December 9, 1945. One day before Patton was scheduled to fly home. It was a Sunday morning, cold and gray in the German countryside near Mannheim. Patton had decided to go pheasant hunting with a friend, General Hobart Gay. They were riding in a 1938 Cadillac staff car, moving slowly through light traffic. At 11:45 in the morning, a U.S. Army truck suddenly turned left directly in front of Patton's car. The collision was low speed. Almost everyone walked away unhurt. General Gay, sitting right next to Patton, suffered only minor bruises. The truck driver was fine. The other passengers were fine. Patton alone was severely injured. He had been thrown forward, striking his head on the metal partition behind the driver's seat. The injury had fractured his third cervical vertebra and left him paralyzed from the neck down. Now ask yourself something. In a low-speed crash where everyone else walked away, why was George Patton the only one thrown forward with enough force to break his neck? The official explanation is that he was sitting upright and was caught off guard. But soldiers who rode in those cars regularly said the partition Patton allegedly struck was much further forward than the impact should have allowed. And there was another detail that nagged at investigators for decades. The Army truck that caused the accident? Its driver was never properly identified. The accident report contained inconsistencies. Key witnesses gave conflicting accounts of where the truck came from and what it was doing on that road. And then, quietly, the investigation was closed. Patton survived the initial crash. He was taken to a military hospital in Heidelberg, where doctors stabilized him and cautiously began to speak about recovery. His wife, Beatrice, flew in from America. He was paralyzed, but he was conscious, sharp-minded, determined. He spoke to his doctors about going home, about what he would do when he recovered. For 12 days it seemed like George Patton might actually survive. And then, without warning, on December 21, 1945, he died. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, and heart failure. His doctors said an embolism had traveled to his heart. Natural complications from his injuries. Sad. Tragic. The end of a great soldier's story. That's what the official record says. But what happened next shocked nearly everyone who looked closely at it. A man named Douglas Bezada came forward decades later. Bezada was no ordinary man. He was a former OSS agent, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. A decorated operative who had run missions behind enemy lines during the war. He was, by any measure, a credible source. And in 1979, at a gathering of former intelligence officers in Washington, Bezada stood up and made a statement that stopped the room cold. He claimed that he had been contracted to assassinate George Patton. Let that land for a moment. Not a conspiracy theorist. Not a tabloid journalist. A decorated OSS officer, speaking in front of his peers, claiming that a plot to kill America's greatest general had been real. Bezada said the order had come from the head of the OSS himself, William Wild Bill Donovan. He claimed the original plan had been to use a specially designed low-velocity gun that could cause fatal internal injuries without leaving obvious marks, the perfect weapon for staging an accident. He said the truck collision had been arranged deliberately. But Bezada also claimed something even more startling. He said that when Patton survived the crash, a secondary operation was put in place. That someone had entered Patton's hospital room and administered a substance, possibly potassium cyanide, that triggered the cardiac event that killed him. Now, was Bezada telling the truth? That's the question that has haunted historians ever since. His story was internally consistent. His credentials were real. He had no obvious financial motive. He made the claim at a private gathering, not a book tour. And some details he provided matched classified documents that only became available years later. But here's the layer that almost no one talks about. Bezada didn't say the assassination was purely an American operation. He suggested, and other researchers have since built on this, that there was Soviet involvement. That Stalin's intelligence service, the NKVD, had made the elimination of Patton a priority. That Soviet operatives had either coordinated with elements inside American intelligence, or had their own parallel operation running simultaneously. Think about what Patton represented to Stalin. This was the one Western general who was openly calling for war with the Soviet Union. The one man with the credibility, the popularity, and the access to classified information to make that argument stick with the American public. If Patton had come home, resigned, and gone on a speaking tour in December 1945, with the war fresh in everyone's minds, with veterans groups hanging on his every word, the political landscape in America might have shifted dramatically. The Truman administration might have faced enormous pressure to adopt a more aggressive posture toward Moscow. NATO might have been built faster. The Soviet grip on Eastern Europe might have been challenged sooner. History, in other words, might have bent in a completely different direction. Stalin couldn't allow that. And here is where Patton's warning takes on its full, chilling weight. In October 1945, just weeks before the fatal car accident, Patton attended a meeting with senior Allied officials in Germany. According to multiple accounts from people present, Patton stood up and delivered what can only be described as a formal warning. He said, and these are paraphrased accounts, but the meaning is consistent across multiple sources, that the Soviet Union was not an ally, that it was an enemy, that it was engaged in the systematic enslavement of European peoples, that its military had been carefully positioned to continue westward at the moment of its choosing, and that if the Western powers did not act to stop it now, they would face a far bloodier conflict later, at a time and place of Stalin's choosing. He reportedly looked around the room and said something to the effect of, "Tell Stalin that we know what he is doing, and that there are men in this army who will not pretend otherwise, no matter who orders them to." It was a declaration, a warning, delivered in the open to men who would report it upward through channels. And within days of that meeting, according to multiple sources, Soviet intelligence had a full account of everything Patton had said. Stalin knew. And Stalin had a long, well-documented history of eliminating men who stood between him and his objectives. Now let's talk about what Patton himself believed. Because in those final weeks, according to people close to him, Patton sensed the danger he was in. He told his wife in letters that he felt surrounded by enemies he couldn't see. He spoke to close friends about his belief that powerful forces, both in the Soviet Union and potentially within Allied command, wanted him neutralized. He had received vague threats. He knew his mail was being read. He knew he was being watched. He once reportedly said, with the dark humor that defined him, "I'll probably get killed in some stupid accident before I can say what needs to be said." Those words, spoken weeks before a car accident on a quiet road. The accident that should have hurt everyone equally but somehow only broke Patton's neck. The accident that was followed 12 days later by a sudden cardiac event in a heavily guarded military hospital. The accident whose truck driver was never properly identified, and whose investigation was quietly closed. Here is the final piece of this story, the one that most history books skip over entirely. In 2008, author Robert Wilcox published a book called Target Patton, after years of research through newly declassified documents and interviews with surviving intelligence operatives. Wilcox concluded that the evidence for an assassination was substantial, not conclusive but far stronger than the official record acknowledged. He found that OSS files relating to Patton had been heavily redacted or removed entirely from the National Archives. He found accounts from multiple individuals who claimed to have knowledge of a plot. He found physical inconsistencies in the accident scene that had never been adequately explained. And he found something that made every piece of the story click into place. A report, buried in an intelligence file, suggesting that Soviet NKVD operatives had been tracking Patton's movements in Germany for months before the accident. That they had identified his car, his schedule, his preferred routes. The man who had delivered the last warning to Stalin had been under surveillance. The hunter, it seemed, had become the hunted. George Patton was buried in Luxembourg at the head of his men as he had requested. Thousands of soldiers lined the road as his coffin passed. Grown men, hardened by years of combat, wept openly. He was 60 years old. He never gave his speech, never wrote his book, never went on his speaking tour. The warning he had delivered in that meeting room in Germany faded into classified files and closed reports. And the world moved on. The Cold War came exactly as Patton had predicted. Eastern Europe disappeared behind the Iron Curtain for nearly 50 years. Millions of people lived under Soviet domination. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania. All the places Patton had pointed to and said, "We are abandoning these people to a monster." He was right about all of it. Was he killed for being right? Was it an accident? A conspiracy? Soviet intelligence? A rogue element inside his own chain of command? The truth, like so many truths from that era, is buried in archives that remain partially classified to this day. The full OSS files on Patton have never been released. The accident investigation records contain gaps that have never been explained. What we know is this: the most dangerous man in the Allied army, dangerous not on the battlefield but politically, ideologically, strategically, died one day before he was supposed to board a plane home. In circumstances that have never been fully explained. At a moment that was almost perfectly convenient for his enemies. And the last warning he ever gave was given to a man who had the motive, the means, and the proven willingness to silence anyone who threatened his plans. So ask yourself this: if George Patton had made it home, if he had given that speech, written that book, stood in front of those veterans and told them the truth about Stalin, would the Cold War have unfolded the way it did? Would those 50 years of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe have happened at all? History doesn't give us do-overs. But it does give us questions. And some questions, the closer you look at them, start to feel less like mysteries, and more like answers we were never supposed to find.